When I was old enough to be home alone, but still very young, I lived in a court in a lower-income middle-class neighborhood. It was a modest developing hamlet just before the city boom, a peaceful spot where youngsters could play from daybreak to late at night with no worries. To be more specific, my court was a U-shape with roughly 8 residences. There was literally only one route in and out. My friend and I resided across the street from one another, just before the curve rounding of the U. We were both 3 houses from the exit. It wasn't a busy street at the exit of our court, so we could play in the main street for hours and just see individuals from our court driving by. That was how isolated the region around us was from the general public. No one came near unless they were visiting our court. There were easier ways to get to the other residences off the main roads, so there was no point in driving or walking by them. Going past our court implied going out of your way to do so. I should also mention that my friend's parents were not hospitable and disliked visitors to their home, so we only ever went to my house or played on the court. This detail will become significant later. It was Halloween, and I had opted to stay at home and go trick-or-treating in my neighborhood with my friend, Ashley. It was late Halloween. The kids had gone home hours before, and the streets were completely silent except for us. My family had left early to go to one of the wealthy districts and acquire the amazing king-size chocolate bars. They planned to hang out at a friend's house and possibly return home late or spend the night, depending on how the evening went. I didn't want to hang out with my younger siblings or their friends. I wanted to spend time with Ash, so I asked to stay at home alone. My mother consented on the condition that I walk inside and lock the home as soon as I entered. I agreed. It was around 10 or 11 p.m. Our night had gone well, and we were winding down while Ashley waited for her parents to bring her into bed. Ashley was sitting with me on the curb in front of my house at that moment. This was a typical occurrence for us until we observed a middle-aged man walking past the end of the court. He looked about as he walked. He paused when he noticed us. As he proceeded, the man slowed and fixed his gaze on us. It was not a major deal, but something seemed odd. Because of how strange it felt to see him, I can still recall what he looked like. We grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, yet I didn't know this man. He was white, average build, and had a beer belly. It was dark, but I could see him under the streetlights. He donned a brown jacket, dark blue jeans, and what appeared to be heavy work boots. He was not a local. Ashley inquired whether I knew him. I shook my head no before continuing our conversation. Still, something about him drew Ashley's attention to the court entrance. He's walking by again. Ashley commented when she observed him pass a second time, and then again. By the 5th time, we began to feel uneasy. Ashley frowned. That guy died again. I moved away from the court door to speak with her. When I did, she murmured urgently, "He's just standing there." I looked, and she was correct. The man was no longer walking. He was simply standing under the street light at the entrance to our court on the same side as us, staring at us. He pushed his hands into his pockets, attempting to appear nonchalant, but he merely stared. We were officially creeped out. I'm creeped out. Let's go inside before he returns. Ashley breathed. We got up, attempting to appear unconcerned. I walked her across the street to her home. Before I went home, I always made sure that my friends were safe. That was exactly who I was. After escorting her to her door, I dashed across the street to my house, desperate to escape to safety, but when I twisted the knob on my front door, it wouldn't move. I froze. The door wouldn't open because it was locked. My family never closed the door until we were inside sleeping. Then I realized I didn't have a key. This was before cell phones. My family had mistakenly locked me out, leaving me with no method of contacting them. I went into a panic. I tried to calm down and decided to go into the backyard and try the sliding glass doors, which should have been unlocked. I proceeded down the front walkway toward the side gate, then came to a halt. My breath held. The man came back. He smiled as he stood at the entrance to the street. He couldn't have strolled around the court at that time. He had to be hidden elsewhere. When he saw me, his eyes brightened up and he waved casually. Then he began heading toward me. His steps were deliberate, almost leisurely, yet he was looking directly at me. I panicked and dashed across the street to Ashley's house. I hammered on the door, pushing the doorbell repeatedly. When Ashley opened the door, she was perplexed by my panic. I yelled, "I am locked out, and he is coming." Ashley hesitated. "I have to ask my mother," she muttered before closing the door. I broke down crying. I turned to see where the man was. He had stopped at the curb, but was now sprinting diagonally toward me. Ashley pushed open the door and grabbed me inside, just as I thought it was too late. She slammed and locked the door. We dashed to the window and peered out. The man stood where I had been. Moments earlier, his chest was heaving and his face was twisted with rage. He scowled at me before slowly backing away, shoving his hands into his pockets and leaving the court. Ashley's mother phoned the cops. I stayed with Ashley till my folks arrived home. Her dad walked me home and explained everything to my mother. My mother held me and apologized passionately. My younger brother had accidentally locked the door before leaving due to his fear of scary guys. After that, I was not left at home alone until we relocated to a new town years later. I'm still not sure what the dude wanted. Kidnapping or worse. I still have no satisfactory answer, and I remain apprehensive around smiling strangers. This occurred several years ago, while I was still living in my childhood home in California. I had recently inherited the family home, so my cousin opted to live with my husband and me while she attended a local college. My cousin and I were both working at the Lego store at the same time, but I only worked in the mornings while my husband and cousin worked. This meant that I was often home alone at night. A few weeks before this occurrence, I was transferring some items to my car when I spotted an odd brown van with no back windows parked across the street. As I loaded the trunk, the man in the van began to make strange noises at me. I turned to have a peek at his face, but his black Giants baseball cap was pulled down low. I dismissed him as a creep and returned inside. When I returned about 2 hours later to leave for a friend's house, the vehicle remained parked across the street. I didn't think much about it and got into my car. As I drove, I noticed the same brown van following me. I turned down many streets, hoping to lose him, but he followed me around every corner. Finally, I decided to pull over in front of my father-in-law's house, thinking that if the guy did anything, I might flee there for protection. As I parked, the van slowed and passed me. I looked inside, and the man made a gun signal with his hand, pointed at me, and exclaimed loudly, "Bang." He then sped away. I was always wary of being home alone, partially because the house had terrible lighting and gave me the creeps. When I was alone at night, I stayed in the kitchen, which was the brightest, around 10 p.m. I was watching TV on my computer when I heard a pounding on the front door and the handle jiggling. It scared me at first, but I believed it was my cousin returning home from work. I checked the timing, and it corresponded to when she typically arrived. I stood up to open the door, but no one was there. I called out her name. However, there was no reaction. I contacted her cell phone because I felt nervous. She responded promptly, saying, "Oh, hello. I'm on my way home from work right now." Before I could react, there were 3 loud bangs on the door connecting the kitchen and garage, and the handle rattled severely. Panicked, I slammed the front door shut, locked and chained it, and dashed into my bedroom. My aunt called, and my cousin contacted the police. I stayed under the covers till my cousin came. When she arrived home, she brought me outside to speak with the cops. I was recounting what happened when I spotted the officers on the side of the home acting suspiciously. I approached, but one police officer kept me back. They'd opened the gate and discovered that the garage door, which we always kept closed, was wide open. The officers took out their firearms and searched the garage, but found no one. Later, they indicated it was probably just kids playing about and urged me to phone them if I ever felt terrified again. About a week later, I was in the living room with my cousin and husband, watching something as I passed the window at the front door. I noticed a man wearing the same black Giants baseball cap standing on the sidewalk, peering at the home. When he recognized me, he locked eyes and gave me the creepiest smile I'd ever seen. I shouted out for my husband, but when I looked back, he was gone. The cap was generic, and many Giants fans wore it, but it felt like the same guy. 3 days later, I was home alone at night again. I was nervous, but trying to tell myself that everything would be all right while baking cookies in the kitchen. I thought I heard a knock on the sliding glass doors. My entire body tightened, as I slowly turned towards it. The backyard lights were turned off, and the brightness of the kitchen lights made it impossible to see outdoors. Everything went still for a second until the knocking began again, this time louder. I yelled and screamed, but was frozen by dread. The intruder darted from the sliding glass door to the living room windows, knocking on them as well. They then returned to the sliding door and attempted to open it. Finally, I snapped out of my fright, grabbed my keys, and dashed to my vehicle. I locked myself in and dialed 911. We sold the house shortly thereafter. Even after moving 2 states away, I still find it difficult to stay at home alone. Music. When I was around 16, my father, brothers, and I lived in an old, dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere. This was a private rental. My brother would work for the landlord to help pay our rent. Our landlord never came across as particularly spooky, but that could be because I rarely stepped outside when he came over to speak with my father. He would not dare to do anything in front of my father. One day, I was home alone. My father and brothers had gone out somewhere, but I don't recall where. I kept my dog in a fenced-in yard outside, but that was it. I was in my room doing whatever I was doing, most likely playing The Sims. Our house was in the middle of nowhere, with a large driveway immediately in front of my bedroom window. When I noticed an automobile other than my father's, I could see or hear it approaching. I immediately scared out. I hurried through the home, closing all the curtains, turning off all the lights, and ensuring that the doors were locked. Our landlord lived next door, about 2 miles away, and that was the closest residence. This wasn't the first time he'd shown up suddenly. It had occurred twice previously, both times when I was alone at home. In previous times, he had only lingered for about 10 minutes, strolling around outside the house before leaving, but this time was different. I took a large kitchen knife and hid underneath the kitchen table. I heard him pull up outside and open our front gate. My dog outside was barking like crazy, and then I heard him say, "Shut up." I could hear his footsteps as he approached the door. He attempted to open it. I was freaking out by this point. I texted my father. He said he was heading home right away, but it would take about an hour. The landlord continued to wander around the house, peeking through each window. The house was old and had 3 separate doors to enter from the outside. He attempted to open all 3. At first, I assumed he didn't realize I was home, that the last 2 occasions were coincidences, but then he began saying things, including shouting out my name. He knew I was home alone. I couldn't hear everything he was saying through the double brick walls, so I crept softly inside the home, following his voice up and down the corridor, trying to figure out what he was saying. That's when I heard him say something I'll never forget. "I'm going to burn down the house, but first I'll let you out." I didn't take him seriously at the time, which terrifies me even more today. He urged me to come out and take his threats seriously. That's the element that appeals to me. I know what would have occurred if I had trusted him. My life would have been very different. He remained for at least 30 minutes, possibly closer to an hour. He persisted. He departed before my father got home. When my father came, I told him everything, and we moved out shortly thereafter. To this day, I'm not sure how he knew I was home alone. My father never passed him on the road as he drove away, so the landlord knew he was gone because there was no car in the driveway. But how did he know I wasn't with him? I'm a 17-year-old female, although at the time of this story, I was probably around 12 or 13. I'm 5 feet 1 inch and weigh 97 pounds now, so I can't imagine how small I must have been back then. After my father's terrible divorce, my older brother and I moved in with my grandmother many years ago. My grandmother required a lot of support with her house and finances, so the move made sense. I went from a calm area to a considerably darker one. Being young, I never considered raising my guard. We rarely closed our doors because my father and grandmother were socialites who frequently went out. If my brother was not present, I would be left alone at home. This was before we had our huge dog, let alone our scrappy little one, so I was utterly alone. Our house is almost a century old, and the strange sounds I'd hear always appeared to have an explanation. But one night while reading a chapter book in my room, I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to the various creaks emanating from the old, worn flooring. My ears perked up as I attempted to recognize the sounds, but fell short. Reassured by the peace, I relaxed for a while, appreciating the quiet and isolation, until the home erupted in commotion. I heard a smash of glass coming from my grandmother's room, which was immediately next to mine. Fear gripped me, but my fight-or-flight instincts took over. Neither choice appeared optimal, as the only way out was to sprint down the stairs, which were right outside my bedroom door. To get there, I have to go through my grandmother's room. Instead, I chose to shut my door and squeeze inside my little closet, clutching my pink Razor cell phone. My first impulse was to contact my father, but my heart fell when his voicemail answered. I didn't want to contact 911 because, even at that age, I knew no one in the house would want the cops prying around. Everyone in the family appeared to have skeletons in their closet, no pun intended. I summoned my bravery and decided to peep under my door. If it appeared clear, I would flee. Leaving the closet, I crouched on the uncomfortable carpet. Within seconds, I noticed shadowy sneakers walking past my door. My breath caught as the shoes slowly and ominously traveled between my father's and grandmother's rooms. When they approached my door, the doorknob jiggled, and my heart raced. Then the banging began. The door shook fiercely as a woman's scream filled the air. Terrified, I hit the call button on my phone. When the 911 operator responded, I whispered that a woman was inside my house and held the phone near the door so they could hear the screaming. The operator informed me that the cops were on their way and instructed me to sit tight. The thumping never stopped, and I was soaked in perspiration and tears. Despite the fact that only a few minutes had passed, I began tearing apart my room in search of any means of protection. I wanted the intruder to assume the room was empty and leave, but I knew she could easily open the door with a coin or a long nail, so I unplugged my lamp and held it as a weapon. Standing in front of the shaky door felt like an agonizingly slow leap from a height. I opened the door and threw it open in one rapid motion, hurling the lamp at a filthy, elderly woman dressed in nasty, tattered clothing. I didn't wait to watch the impact. Instead, I dashed down the stairs, hoping not to trip, and smashed through the front door, racing directly to my neighbor's house. While I didn't know them well, I knew they were wonderful people because of my grandmother. 2 cop cars arrived immediately after my neighbor informed them of what I had told her, and they swept my house. They emerged with the woman in custody, blood dripping from a cut beneath her right eye. Her feeble, untidy appearance made me feel guilty. I believed I could just dash past her without hurting her, but that notion didn't last long. After hours of speaking with the police, my father sat me down in the kitchen. When I stated that the cop had claimed she was confused and abused, he assured me that I had done the right thing and not to feel horrible. He revealed something the police had not told me. The woman had not attempted to take anything, despite the fact that both my father's and grandmother's rooms had been ransacked. She was carrying a paring knife and a needle filled with an unknown material. Later, we discovered she had confessed to breaking in to steal goods to sell for narcotics. The needle contained a combination of illicit substances. Not long after, we got our first dog, who has since come to my rescue several times. I've developed a rigid habit of locking my door. Initially, I just closed it while sleeping, but the unsettling feeling of being alone in my room persisted. My door is now always locked when I'm inside. My husband and I lived in a little 2-story house with 2 major entrances, one in the front and one on the side that led into the laundry room. When we were too busy or it was too late to walk our dog, we'd link his collar to a long line attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house, allowing him to use the restroom. We used to do this from the door of our laundry room, but we observed that the large step from the door to the ground was straining his hips. As a result, we began letting him out through the front door, as the porch was considerably closer to the ground. One night, I was at home alone with my dog, and it was almost midnight when I decided to let him out one last time before bedtime. I connected him to his line, closed and locked the door, and went into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was very typical. Even if he went to the restroom fast, he liked to go around the front and side of the house for a few minutes before returning inside. While I was putting away the dishes, I heard a scrape on the door. This was how my dog indicated he wanted to come inside, so I went over to let him back in. Because I've seen far too many terrifying movies, I always check the door's peephole before opening it. Out of habit, I checked to see if my dog was in front of the door. Instead, I noticed a man peering carefully at the doorknob. I froze, my hand on the door handle, I'm not sure how much time had passed, but suddenly I heard another scratch, this time louder. That jolted me out of my initial disbelief, and I dashed to get my cell phone. I contacted my husband to inform him what was going on. He was perplexed, possibly because I wasn't describing the situation clearly enough, but he said he was on his way home. It was then that I noticed my dog was still out with this individual. I returned to the front door, making as little noise as possible to see if the guy was still there. He stood there, head lowered, looking at the doorknob like he had done previously. I tiptoed over to the washing room and opened the door as slowly and softly as possible. I couldn't see my dog anywhere, and the side of my house was covered in gravel, making it impossible to walk outdoors without making a lot of noise and my panic beating in my chest. I returned to the front entrance to keep an eye on the guy and get a closer look at him. I pondered calling the cops, but I didn't believe they'd take me seriously because all the man did was stand in front of my house. I attempted taking a picture of him with my phone, but it only captured the peephole and not what was behind the glass. Suddenly, the man stared directly at me. I swear he knew I was present. He looked at me before opening his mouth to reveal a taunting, evil grin. He stood there. After a few seconds, he turned around and began strolling down the street. I remained in the same spot, almost expecting him to hurry back and begin beating on the door. Fortunately, my husband came just a few minutes later. Long story short, he persuaded me to phone the cops, and we headed outside to look for our dog. It turned out that the man had cut the end of the line that linked to the pipe, and our dog decided it was a good time to investigate our neighbor's yard. That is where we found him. It has been 3 years since this happened. We've now moved to a new home for other reasons, and the police were unable to identify any suspects. Since then, we've made a habit of taking our dog for long walks before the sun goes down.